And since we're at the top of the hour, I think I'm just gonna jump right in. People will likely be trickling in for the next minute or two, but for those of you who are with us already, hello and welcome. I'm Nellie Stansbury, Denison Consulting's marketing specialist. Welcome to the latest installment of our monthly webinar series. To get started, please test the functionality of the questions and answers or the chat features below on this webinar by sharing where in the world you are joining us from. Today, we are returning our attention to diversity and inclusion, which you will hear us reference periodically as D&I. While there has been a significant uptick in awareness around D&I in recent years, some organizations have become discouraged when their D&I progress is slow or difficult to sustain long-term. This webinar will focus on the connections between D&I and organizational culture, developing a D&I action planning process, implementing and sustaining D&I policies and practices, and common challenges in D&I initiatives. I would like to now introduce our panelists. Joining us today are Valerie, Corey, Meredith, and Lauren. Valerie is a senior consultant and executive coach at Denison Consulting. She has over 20 years of experience working for Fortune 100 companies in human resources and organizational development. Her experience managing large-scale change initiatives, coupled with her leadership coaching and performance management expertise, contributes to her success in leading companies through their transformational culture efforts. Corey Jackson serves as the consulting support manager at Denison. He joined the Denison team after working at the University of Michigan and has experience in teaching, management, hiring processes, and customer support. His role at the company includes handling logistics, presentation development, and financial support for the senior consulting team. Meredith Grzyb is a client success manager at Denison Consulting. She joined the Denison team after working internationally as a buyer in the automotive industry. With a passion for coaching and creating effective processes and teams, she works with our client success team to support clients as they walk through their unique culture transformations. Lauren is an associate research consultant at Denison Consulting. She joined the team after starting her PhD in industrial and in organizational psychology at Wayne State University. Her role at Denison includes conducting custom analytics for clients, preparing deliverables for clients and internal support documents, and aggregating research for culture and organizational outcomes. And I, again, am Nellie Stansbury, a marketing specialist at Denison. I joined Denison in June of this year, working in the nonprofit. I worked in the nonprofit sector and as a digital marketing consultant beforehand. I work closely with every department at Denison to create and promote content that both furthers the Denison brand and supports our clients and partners. While many of you are familiar with Denison, I'd like to briefly overview who we are and what we do. Denison Consulting is a firm focused on large-scale culture transformation and leadership development, headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with a European office based out of Zurich, Switzerland. Our global reach has allowed us to do work in over 50 countries and to develop diverse research and diagnostics. Next, I'd like to overview our mission. Our mission is to improve organizational performance by developing corporate culture and leadership. Our global team of experts uses our set of diagnostic assessments rooted in research to provide transformation services to our clients. Next, I'd like to overview our monthly webinar series, what we've worked on over the past few months, and what we have planned for the future. Our monthly webinar series has covered a lot of impactful topics already, and we plan to continue researching and sharing with you during future sessions as well. Our August and September webinars focused on digitalization and the impact the pandemic has had on accelerating the digitalization process for many organizations. Our research showed us that both organizations and leaders alike have had to adapt their beliefs and assumptions about leadership, culture, and the work environment throughout this time of crisis. In October, we began our conversation around the value of diversity and inclusion through the lens of the path to high performance, understanding the connections between diversity and inclusion, methods of measuring your current D&I practices, and connecting your D&I initiative to actionable steps. Today, we will continue that conversation and focus on the connections between D&I and organizational culture, developing and implementing action planning processes, sustaining improvement, and common challenges in D&I initiatives. To wrap up the year in December, we will share a client's incredibly impactful culture transformation story. More details to come soon. We look forward to sharing more information about that with all of you in the coming weeks. Before I turn the presentation over to Lauren, I'd like to briefly overview what we will be talking about today. So like I mentioned, we will talk about the connections between diversity and inclusion and organizational culture. Next, we'll talk about developing a D&I action planning process, which includes building the action planning team, identifying any issues and understanding them fully, and brainstorming actions to address those challenges. Then we'll talk about implementing and sustaining D&I policies and practices, which includes translating cultural shifts into concrete changes for leaders and employees, creating an environment of accountability, and clearly defining an ideal state and measurable steps to embodying it. And then we'll talk briefly about an analysis of our D&I assessment and some common D&I challenges that we've encountered. And then we've dedicated a bit of time for questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Lauren to start talking about the connections between D&I and organizational culture.
Great, thank you, Nellie. So as Nellie said, I'm Lauren. I am a research consultant associate at Denison, and I will be going over what we see as far as phases that different organizations tend to be in when it comes to D&I efforts, and then the connection between D&I and culture. But I do just want to thank you all again for being here. I know that the team is very excited to be continuing this conversation with you all on how we can create lasting and impactful D&I initiatives. I did want to start us off today by reiterating something that Valerie had mentioned during the first installment of this webinar series, and that is what we've learned through both research and experience with our clients to create an aggregated understanding of where organizations are at with their D&I efforts. And what we found is that there's no cookie cutter approach, there's no clear-cut beginning or end to implementing and sustaining D&I initiatives, but we do see that organizations tend to fall into these three broad categories. Those who are just starting out with D&I tend to treat it as a compliance issue or a check the box issue where there may be intentions to hire people of diverse backgrounds, but none of the practices or policies of an organization reflect or support this. Often in this phase, having a diverse and inclusive workplace is not recognized as a core value or a mission of the company, and because of this, these organizations fall short in attracting, selecting, and retaining diverse employees. Then there are many organizations that have recognized the need for intentional recruitment and selection practices, but still see D&I as being housed in a talent issue. In this intermediate phase, diverse members are often brought into the organization, but expected to fit into the dominant norms and culture of that organization. Thus, the objective of diversity might be achieved, but the inclusivity portion is still lacking. We see that a lot of organizations are currently in phase 2, but we do see a distribution across all these phases. Then there are organizations in the advanced phase where they see D&I efforts as core to the organization, and all members from top down, bottom up, and across functions are included in the D&I initiative. In this phase, we find that organizations have strong leadership commitment, and they align their core values and mission with the practices that support and encourage not only a diverse workforce, but also an inclusive working environment where all employees have equal resources and are welcomed and encouraged to bring their unique background and perspectives to the table. Even in these advanced phases, there may be certain areas where D&I efforts fall short or are being experienced differently by certain groups of people, and these organizations often seek to create more impactful action plans for improving these weaker areas. Our culture survey, modules, and Path to High Performance are all centered around organizing change initiatives in a research-based and flexible way. That means that we are able to meet you where you are at, regardless of whether you're in an early phase, not sure what to do to start your D&I journey, or maybe don't even have a good definition of what D&I means to you and your organization, or in a more advanced phase and are looking to further improve your efforts to create a diverse, inclusive, and equitable environment. I won't spend too much time reviewing the specific steps of the path to high performance now, as they will be touched on throughout the remainder of the webinar, but I did want to highlight the importance of the flexibility and adaptability that we built into this model and how that is especially important for D&I efforts. Regardless of how far along you are with your D&I efforts, steps like measuring where you are at, creating meaningful action plans based on a common vision and current understanding of D&I are always going to be important and relevant. In the first Culture of Belonging webinar, we focused on the first half of the path to high performance, and for this webinar, we'll focus mostly on the second half, where Meredith, Valerie, and Corey will take a deeper dive into what impactful action planning, sustainable implementation, and continuous improvement for D&I looks like, as well as highlighting some of the common themes that can prevent success of D&I work. All right, and the next thing I wanted to discuss today is the connection between culture and D&I. At Denison, we see culture as core to holistically understanding the underlying health and well-being of an organization. We see culture as the mechanism that drives any and all relevant and important organizational outcomes. And in order to create meaningful change, culture must be incorporated and considered in the work that you're doing. In order to understand this unique relationship between culture and D&I, we mapped key cultural outcomes associated with D&I efforts to our circumplex. And what we see is that when an organization has a culture that empowers individuals, values teamwork and coordination, fosters organizational learning, and continuous capability development, D&I efforts can thrive. And next, we can see that the approach at Denison tends to be different from other approaches. So we provide a robust relationship with predicting performance with key links to important KPIs, whether that's financial performance or employee attitudes, like commitment, engagement, retention. And we provide a lens through which organizational culture can look at D&I to provide more actionable insights into how D&I efforts can be successful, while some other approaches don't always consider these factors. So looking at both D&I efforts and organizational culture helps identify key risk areas, current perspectives and understanding around D&I, and helps prioritize opportunities for change. Next, we can see that our D&I module is supplementary to our Denison Culture Survey. We focus on analyses that create a clear understanding of the current need of the organization, regardless of where you are at in your D&I journey. And with that work, we also recognize the importance of being intentional with how we segment the data into subgroups, to focus on how individuals with different backgrounds may have very different perceptions than the majority. On the next slide, we can see our D&I module, which has 10 items touching on different areas regarding D&I. These were created to provide a holistic view of where your organization is at with D&I, and the items were generated in a way to clarify risk areas and steps that can be taken to improve D&I efforts by asking about perceptions of inclusion and respect, workplace discrimination, fair and equal access to opportunities, and leadership commitment to values. Lastly, we created different options for open-ended questions. And these enable organizations to see exactly how their employees are feeling. Having this level of qualitative information provides an even richer look into the way that D&I is perceived by members of an organization. We have broken these out into different categories where certain questions may provide more useful information than others, depending on what phase of the D&I journey an organization might be in. For example, organizations in a very early phase may not have a good understanding of what D&I is, what it means to the organization. So some of the questions regarding commitment to D&I and defining D&I might be helpful in providing a path for how to get started in treating D&I as more than a check the box issue. On the other hand, organizations that are in more intermediate or advanced phases might benefit more from asking open-ended questions about how to further build organizational capabilities beyond what is already done. So all in all, the path to successfully diverse and inclusive workplace looks different for everyone, and that's something that we recognize. And by carefully analyzing all the factors, including culture, that can influence perceptions of diversity and inclusion at your workplace, that is the path to make meaningful plans that can sustain your D&I efforts. And with that, I will pass it on to Valerie.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here. And, this first part is to really drive home and illustrate some examples of how culture and D&I connect. And so when you take your assessment, we can do what we call a driver analysis. So as Lauren mentioned, there are links to D&I into our culture model. What this is able to do is look at your unique cultural drivers within your organization that are actually connected to diversity and inclusion. So as you see here, pretty high levels of diversity and inclusion are showing up within this data set for an organization relative to some of the things that are high as well in terms of a cultural driver. So those are things we want to sustain. We want to build action plans around those things so that we don't lose that clarity and alignment, that strength within our culture, because that does have a direct link to helping us embed and integrate D&I initiatives and ultimately create a diverse and inclusive work environment. The bottom half are describing to you what are those cultural drivers that you're above 50th percentile on most of these. But those are things that are really highly correlated and have a strong relationship to that company's D&I efforts. So those are things we want to also drive action on to help to improve the culture. What you're seeing here is one client example and of high levels of diversity and inclusion, as well as cultural attributes. It's not always the case. So what I'd like to share with you is another example. This one is one where diversity and inclusion is a challenge. It's difficult, and there are definitely things that we need to be pulling from and driving toward from a cultural perspective to help create that level of clarity and alignment in diversity and inclusion. Things like creating a clear mission that gives meaning to the employees and their work. Widespread agreement around goals. So those are unique drivers, again, that's going to help this organization improve their diversity and inclusion. Those happen to be their highest scored items. While you see those numbers there, they're still below the 50th percentile, but those are the highest correlated cultural attributes that are going to help this organization move the needle in diversity and inclusion, as well as some of the unique drivers that are areas of improvement. These are well below the 50th percentile, which is average performance. And so these are things that we also want to unpack, uncover some of the problems that are showing up, some examples. We can use that qualitative data as well as conducting some other exercises, which we'll be taking you through in a little bit. So hopefully that starts to paint the picture of why measure culture and D&I, so they can really get the full picture of what it's like to work within your organization, and how do we start to improve and build more diverse and inclusivity. Excuse me. So before I hand it over to Meredith, who's going to walk us through our best practices in engaging an action team around this data, I want to kind of bring us back to where do we need to start from, and I always say, start with the end in mind. So really identifying some of the critical factors success factors that we want to start to see in our culture. So articulating the vision for diversity and its connection to the mission. So that's something senior leaders can do early on and really define diversity, what it looks like, but also link it to the vision and the mission of the organization. Our assessments, our tools, provide a common language for you to use, a framework, so that you can have conversations around diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence. And that common language helps create that open dialogue and get us all on the same page, essentially. You also have to build a business case for diversity, which outlines the ways in which diversity can improve operations, your business performance. Again, our model is linked to business metrics. So we also want to see from a diverse and inclusive perspective, how are we going to be driving even more business outcomes and effectively achieve the organization's mission. With any big initiative, we always want to also identify what are the key outcomes, what are we hoping to achieve, what will success look like? What are some of those outcomes that we want to be able to track and measure so that we can sustain the improvement, hopefully, that we are able to make? The other really big key, both in culture and diversity and inclusion, is that open environment, inclusive environment where people feel safe to say what they think. There's honest, candid conversations that drive honest actions. So more to come around this process, but I will turn it over to Meredith to kind of get us started on who does this work? How do we start to organize ourselves around an action team? Meredith?
Thank you, Valerie. So as Valerie was starting to describe and explain, action teams are all about creating cross-functional teams that partner with executive sponsorship and with the leadership team to help translate the vision into actionable steps and aligned actions. And just to do that, you have to share with the organization at large and allow for collaboration on the action plans, build action plans based on the vision and goals, and then align those action plans and your vision and goals of your D&I initiative to the overall organization vision and goals, and make sure that those are aligned, and that as a team you are working together to not only increase transparency and ultimately buy-in across the organization, but you're helping take steps towards making that vision happen, and you're working together as an organization to really take successful and effective steps forward. There's several critical success factors that we'll get into in the next slide. And the first being securing the direct sponsorship and participation of senior leadership. And I think this is honestly the key critical success factor to making any sort of action planning effective and successful. So your actions need to be, and your action teams need to be commissioned by your senior leadership team. And they need to be focused on the core issues at every single step. And you'll see an operational and strategic partnership start to take place, and you'll start to build that partnership between the action planning team and your leadership team. And we'll get more into what that partnership should look like in the next slide. So to truly build a successful relationship between an action planning team and your senior leadership team, there's several gives and gets. So an action team will give the senior leadership team just the brain and legwork to move forward towards action, feedback that is representative of the organization as a whole, and insight into what is being seen and heard. And the senior leadership team will get from that action team a partner for aligned action and input and perspective on strategic matters. So they're getting more insight into maybe areas of the organization that they wouldn't really be able to see, and getting more insight into what their actions and visions and how they're being perceived from an organizational level, and also a partner in how to move forward, and also creating that transparency that I talked about, and in the end, just overall organizational buy-in. And from there, the senior leadership team will give the action team a stance on and clarity of what D&I means to the organization. So they're providing that vision and that goal. They're creating a link from the D&I strategy to the organization's mission. So they're providing purpose and giving a tone and basis for change and development, insight into decisions and priorities, and active participation in the action team. So they're helping define the steps that should be taken and providing clarity as to the what and the why, and helping figure out the how as well. So they're involved in every single step to truly helping that initiative and those actions be successful. And from the senior leadership team, the action team will get support for action on core issues and challenges, a partner for problem solving and barrier removal, and visibility of actions through the senior leadership team communication. So they're getting that greater transparency and knowledge into things that maybe they can't see from their level, and that helps increase the buy-in as well. Okay. In our next slide, we'll talk about critical success factor 2, which is who is a part of that team. And what does that look like? And you want to choose people that are not only interested in the initiative, but also respected across the organization and problem solvers. You want to get subject matter experts and people that are across departments so that everyone is well represented and that every voice is heard as much as possible. You also want people that want to bring change and want to support that change and that are willing to speak up and say the hard things sometimes that need to be said and are willing to really have those conversations with the leadership team, but also with the organization as a whole and help just drive that change and the initiative forward. All right, and as the next slide is coming up, the third critical success factor is establishing a productive operating rhythm. So to do so, you'll need to clarify and contract the roles on the team. So you're going to clarify who does what and expectations. You're going to set the productive team norms. So this is how we're going to do things. This is how we're going to take steps forward. And then create a process and tools for the action planning so that truly is sustainable and effective for your organization. And every organization will look different. So the operating rhythm will be unique to you. And it's something that we've had a lot of experience helping organizations create and build, and something we would definitely help partner with you to help create that operating rhythm. A big part of this is knowing just the different roles, which is something we'll get into in the next slide. So the first that we've talked a lot about is your executive sponsor. You want a member of the leadership team who's responsible for making the decisions and providing resources, that a person that can visibly lead change for the organization and communicate effectively and manage relationships and help just measure and provide rewards for taking effective steps forward. To be an effective sponsor, you need to be able to provide context and vision for shaping the future, promoting the desired culture and demonstrating commitment to that culture, being able to respond and listen to feedback, and also just be able to explain key decisions to the organization and creating that transparency with your action team. The team lead of the action team is responsible for understanding and almost evangelizing the benefits and the values without being called upon to do so, so that they are moving that initiative forward. They are helping provide more information from the leadership team to the organization and to the team, and also just explaining what behaviors help promote that desired culture. So they're making it more easy to digest and also easily understood. To be an effective team lead, they need to reinforce and model the behaviors of the desired cultural behaviors, contribute to the leadership team meetings, and help problem solve on key focus areas to create improvement. And then the teammates or the team members of the culture action team are responsible for communicating the change and helping adopt and leading that adoption of the new behaviors and tools and demonstrating that within their own departments and within their own business units. So they're helping really make this, they're leading through action and they're leading through example, which is so key and so important to truly help action planning be effective. And they're having that open dialogue with leadership to provide updates and solicit feedback of what's being experienced throughout the organization. And they serve as the first point of escalation for barriers to creating a healthier culture, and just provide frequent updates as they're trying to shape the culture and push the initiative forward. I'll now have Valerie talk more about how we apply this effectively and what action planning can look like at an even deeper level.
Great, thank you, Meredith. So now that you have the action team and you've identified the key players in driving action in the organization, now it's what do we do with that team? How do we leverage that team? How do we get them started? And we use a pretty simple but profound habits exercise. It's a framework to start honest conversations to uncover not only the beliefs and assumptions, but also some of the routines, practices, that they see within the organization, specifically both from a cultural perspective, but also through that D&I lens as well. And so I want to share with you an output collected from several organizations, just to give you a flavor for what that could look like. But before I do that, again, this is an easy framework. It's basically looking at what are some things that are good within our organization that's in enabling diversity and inclusion. We want to preserve and strengthen those things. So what are some of those? What are some of those things that we need to leave behind, let go of? They're no longer serving us, or they're conflicting with our diversity and inclusion efforts. There's oftentimes things that we don't have, we need to invent and perfect. And so looking through that lens of creativity and innovation around how do we help sustain the culture, but also improve the culture as well as our diversity and inclusion efforts. So ideas around what we need to invent. And then there could be things that we've tried before that we just need to dust off, rethink, and try again. Things that are, will help us achieve our vision as well as our vision and diversity and inclusion. So let me share an example of some outputs that just kind of paint the picture for you. So some things that we've heard around Preserve, they hold town hall meetings where there's a two-way conversation happening. So information is shared and they have a chance to react, ask questions. So that two-way dialogue is really critical. And that's something that this organization really felt like we do that well and we want to continue doing that. Being clear around the mission, values, and vision, and really communicating that in a way that's top of mind and connected to all of the work that people are doing. So that's another area of something that they'd like to see preserved. Things to let go of. Some organizations, they have habits of talking over one another, interrupting one another. They invite diverse groups of people to a meeting, yet they're not really listening or asking for their input, or they're asking for input into decisions, more like a check the box. So we invite, get your feedback, but the decision has already been made. So more of a check the box type of activity. Things that our client organizations have thought of in terms of inventing that stand out, create strategic goals for diversity and inclusion. Update and clarify the stance on diversity and inclusion from a leadership perspective, as Meredith and Lauren have already talked about, really making sure there's a sense of urgency to embed new habits, new things to the day-to-day work to improve your overall operating performance. And then create diverse and inclusive standard practices. Some organizations feel like it's unclear what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and how do we hold each other accountable if there's no sense of a standard practice. So that was one thing that an organization decided that's something that we need and that we want to invent. Some things that came under the reshape from our client organizations, many have focused on hiring practices to increase their diverse talent pool, but maybe just dusting that off and making sure that they're, with the new information and making sure that they're also not just hiring new talent, but they're bringing them in a way that's inclusive and open to their fresh new ideas and approaches to doing business. So mentoring programs also have been around for a long time. This organization felt like those mentoring programs were so focused on high potentials or high performers that we were leaving out so many employees that really did need some guidance around how they can succeed in the organization. So really reshaping their mentoring program. And then skip level meetings. Many of you probably know what that looks like, but this is really meaningful. They have done it, but it was more of a check the box, and they really wanted to create more inclusivity, really making sure that there were more honest dialogues, and it wasn't just I met with my 6 direct reports of my direct report. We're actually kind of building that muscle. So hopefully this paints a picture of what typical outputs you can glean from the habits exercise. And you probably are noticing there's both D&I and culture that shows up within those conversations. So we have an action team. we've done the habits exercise, so now what? Now it's time to really kind of roll up our sleeves, figure out what are those problems, you know, with the things that we want to let go of, the things we want to invent, what are some of the things that are getting in our way? So the first and foremost is, what does success look like? What do we want to see in the workplace? So what does that future state look like? Who are the key stakeholders? Who needs to be involved? Who will need to be informed? And then there always are people that need to be consulted, but not heavily involved in the process. So really honing in on that for each problem statement that you're trying to solve. The big thing here too is, you know, assigning ownership, responsibility, and being clear and communicating who that is. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with culture action teams in particular that they don't have that sense of who owns this. They're all doing really great work, but there's nobody really owning it and keeping it on track. So a lot of times they have a lot of momentum, but they kind of, that fizzles over time and they get busy in their day-to-day work. So really assigning responsibility and accountability is an important piece of that. And then those timelines, milestones, you know, keeping your progress on track, communicating that progress. And again, this is for each of those problem statements. And I should have that bolded in red, communication plan. All of these efforts have to be communicated. They have to be on the forefront of conversations with employees. Part of, you know, the team lead's role is making sure that everybody is understanding what's happening in terms of creating a diverse and inclusive environment, but also a healthier, high-performing culture. So communication plans with key messages, audience it's intended for, and then who actually should be communicating those things. So quick 5 steps in terms of what to be thinking about as you're starting to embark on the actual action planning process. When you have those problems, you identify those problems, you've thought through some actions, brainstorming actions. Another really critical step is to prioritize those. What we want to do is figure out what are those quick wins, those things that we could implement today and have high impact within the organization, both from a culture and a diversity and inclusion perspective. There's also going to be things that are more heavy lifting that are going to take some time, resources. So we want to know what those are as well, and then things that are in the queue that we may not put a lot of effort into just yet, but we want to keep track of those actions. So because culture never ends, right? And neither does diversity and inclusion. So prioritizing is really critical. Our prioritization matrix is pretty simple. It's just a 9-box. You're looking at the level of impact relative to the difficultness or the resources required. Now the real work begins, implementation. So you've got actions, you have your team in place, you've created ownership. Now what? Now it's time to actually implement those actions. And making sure, again, sometimes the culture action teams are not the same people who are actually implementing those actions. So making sure you're assigning responsibility to those subject matter experts. The culture action team helps to kind of drive those actions further into the organization, but making sure you've assigned responsibility. I can't emphasize enough creating that environment to create, you know, facilitate feedback and adjust as needed, both within the D&I as well as your culture. So creating a feedback mechanism is really important, or several feedback mechanisms, and we'll get into some examples of those in a bit. You know, the other piece to this, as Lauren and Meredith have mentioned as well, leadership is so critical to this. They set the tone for culture, they set the tone for D&I efforts. They need to be visible, and they need to be visible taking action as well. So in terms of implementation best practices, you'll see here, you know, sometimes you're a couple of months along the way and it's time to, wait a second, have we connected some of our strategies through that lens of D&I? So making sure you redefine current D&I strategies and solutions and determine whether or not there's something in the organization that has to change in terms of the structures, the process, and even more importantly, embed that in the strategy. There may be things that you need to invent in terms of new methods to access and promote progress on an individual and organizational level. You know, again, we talked last time about, you know, D&I is at 3 levels. First, it's building awareness at the individual, then it's building awareness around the teams, as well as the organization. So new methods may need to be implemented. And then again, preserve and perfect, highlight the practices and events that are supporting your D&I efforts. So in other words, celebrate your successes and really showcase them and make sure it's publicly visible that these efforts are happening. I also see a lot of great work that gets unnoticed because they fail at communicating and getting some of that, the successes out there. You also want to be strategic in terms of tying the D&I integration elements to the business case, right? So making sure that people are seeing this as not another effort outside of the day-to-day and the business strategy that we have, but it's embedded in the business strategy. So it improves the way that we work and get our work done. And then you also want to, again, articulate the mission within the context of our outcomes that we've determined before. So really making sure they may be new implemented strategies that you need to as you're in this journey. So a few implementation best practices for you to consider. Sustainable improvement, you know, much like anything else, in order to sustain improvement, you need to be able to make sure that you have a rigorous, disciplined approach to figure out where you are in that process, that tracking mechanism. You could reassess, you could use the diagnostic tools again and be able to for sure know if you've moved the dial or not. But there are other more informal things that you can put into place to make sure that you're testing whether or not change has really happened. So, and always revisit the vision and the understanding of the D&I initiative as needed. And then the other key factors that we want to be paying attention to is, again, evaluating and modifying the goals and objectives. There may be new goals now based on some of the efforts that have been made. So really making sure that you're constantly looking for future planning. How do we continue to drive diversity and inclusion in our organization? Seek and measure to determine, have we made any change? What are the changes that we've made, and where do we need to still make some effort? And then we need to also seek and recommit some of our culture action teams, but also those that have been, you know, fully communicating and implementing some of the actions. So it's a chance to have that recommitment so that they know that this is an ongoing journey. And then more importantly than most of what I've shared here is that communication. Continually communicate, especially if there are new goals and strategies and across the organization. So hopefully this has helped kind of outline some of the best practices, both from a culture action team, you know, building action team plans and implementing those plans and sustaining those plans. Now I'm going to turn it over to Corey, who's going to be talking about our experience and some of the common themes and challenges organizations have shared with us. Corey?
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to start with the assessment themes that we've gathered throughout our research. So across 23 organizations, these were the cultural items that we found to be the most correlated with our D&I assessment. And the culture items tie back to our model. So as a reminder, the blue is the adaptability area, the yellow is the consistency area, and the green is the involvement area. So the first item, learning, is an important objective in our day-to-day work. The second one, there's an ethical code that guides our behavior and tells us right from wrong. 3, capabilities of people are viewed as an important source of competitive advantage. 4, There's a clear agreement about the right way and the wrong way to do things. Next, it is easy to coordinate projects across different parts of the organization. The next one, teamwork is used to get work done rather than hierarchy. The next one, information is widely shared so that everyone can get the information he or she needs when it's needed. Next, there's a clearly defined culture. And finally, all members have a deep understanding of customer wants and needs. So you see a theme here that most of the items are internally focused, so in that yellow and green area. However, it's also important to have an external view of your D&I practices as well, which you see with the customer wants and needs, making sure that you're appealing to your diverse market and also valuing learning in your day-to-day work. So next, I'm gonna cover some common challenges we've seen from organizations we work with in initiating their D&I practices in their organization. So the first one we see is there's a lack of leadership buy-in. So the important thing to note is that organizational change begins at the top. So the leadership has to vocalize their commitment to D&I and allocate those resources to the D&I efforts if they want that to be a sustainable initiative. The next thing we see is that organizations struggle from a lack of accountability in their D&I initiatives. So it's important to define and communicate a clear set of D&I outcomes first before you set the action plan. So that way you'll be successful in achieving those outcomes. Organizations should also complement inclusive policies with a focus on inclusive employee performance as well in order to make sure that that accountability is upheld. And next, individuals have to acknowledge that they can shift the culture and D&I impact through small, significant actions. Changing a culture is a big initiative, and if you're not acknowledging the small wins, then it's going to be difficult to reach that final goal. Next, mediocre coordination and teamwork will be a challenge for D&I initiatives. So leaderships should practice transparent decision making. And you'll also make sure to note that successful teams include diverse personalities, skills and experience and work styles, in addition to various backgrounds and genders, ethnicities. So in order to make sure that that team is coordinating and working together smoothly, it's just important that you're aware of how you're coordinating, if it's transparent decision making and that those teams are being utilized properly. And then finally, a lot of D&I initiatives struggle from being too hyper-focused on business results. So seeing the bottom line, and that's very important to be aware of that. However, you want to make sure that that's not the only goal, because diversity can be a competitive differentiator for top talent, but increasing the diversity at an organization is not going to automatically increase your organizational effectiveness. You have to make sure that you're including those talent and also effectively utilizing their differences in order to see those business results that you hope to see. So leaders have to challenge the notion that maximizing shareholder returns is paramount and embrace a broader vision of success. So next, I'm going to go into some ways to address each challenge as well. So first, to address the absence of leadership commitment buy-in, what does successful leadership commitment look like? So leadership can commit to D&I by ensuring that the leadership team itself is diverse. Are there different points of view allowed on the leadership team? are there diverse demographics represented on that leadership team? You have to get specific about internal and external actions that you're taking. So have you defined what your organization stands for as opposed to what your organization is against? Because sometimes organizations will take a strong stand against something for D&I, but you want to make sure that your organization is clear about what you are for as opposed to what you're against. Next, you want to increase, the leadership has to increase the understanding of their current perspectives on D&I. So how are individuals in the organization defining diversity? How are they defining inclusion? And there are various ways to capture that, surveys, focus groups. And then you want to embed D&I into the organization's vision, which is also very important. So have you clearly defined the organization's philosophy and vision about diversity and its connection to the mission? And then finally, you got to move past the potential discomfort of discussing D&I. And sometimes that's brought on by not effectively defining D&I to begin. Some people initially jump to race or other categories when they think about D&I, but D&I can be defined in various ways. So it's important to think about what D&I means to your organization before tackling those challenges, and that'll make it a lot easier to move past the discomfort of discussing it. So next, we're moving on to the lack of accountability. So organizations risk being perceived as lacking true commitment to building diverse workforces and inclusive cultures without demonstrating sustained, tangible impact that validates their efforts. So how can these organizations and individuals redirect their approach and elevate accountability? So you want to make the accountability personal. So one way to do that is to define organizational D&I strategy before taking action. So those leaders work with the broad representation of the workforce to co-create targeted actions, timelines, success measures, and define leaders. You want to tie business goals to the D&I strategy, the what, to a clear set of inclusive leadership expectations that are required to drive outcomes, the how. So do we measure leaders' inclusive behaviors over time and tie their impact directly to performance and total rewards? And finally, I want to give the workforce the skill and the will to discuss D&I. So do we offer accessible forums for diverse groups to ask questions, share experiences, and learn skills? And have we provided resources for individuals to utilize for self-guided learning? So next, we're going to look into the mediocre coordination and teamwork that organizations struggle with. And one of those ways is asking yourself in the organization, how can the leaders model inclusivity by promoting coordination, collaboration, and teamwork? And one of those ways to do that is to ensure a sense of inclusive collaboration at your organization. So how you're going to do that is you want to share your D&I action plan with the organization at large and allow for collaboration on that initiative. So think about how are you fostering trust and employee engagement in your decision making. Next, you want to facilitate large group dialogues. So how is your organization creating an environment where individuals are able to contribute to conversations? Do teams feel comfortable working outside their departments? And this is a major one that I would say is important to establish at your organization even before launching a D&I initiative, because you want an inclusive environment before bringing on diverse talent. And also provide feedback opportunities to employees across all levels of the organization. So do your employees feel supported? And do you listen to their feedback and take appropriate action? And that's all going to help you create an inclusive environment for sustaining your D&I practices. And finally, we can address the area of the hyper-focus on business results. So organizations that embrace D&I fully find that it leads to higher quality work, better decision-making, and greater team satisfaction, and more equality. And this is all going to make your business stronger. So how do organizations and leaders authentically leverage diversity to increase business performance? And one way is to embrace a broader vision of success. So you want to prioritize flexibility and versatility at your organization. So do you challenge assumptions? Do you encourage learning, innovation, creativity, equity, and dignity at your organization? Next, you want to actively combat discrimination and subordination when it's seen at your organization. So have you created the atmosphere of psychological safety for your employees? And do you encourage organizational and individual learning about D&I and about inclusivity at your organization? And finally, you want to make differences a resource for learning. So are leaders facilitating open discussions about how identity groups shape employee experiences inside and outside the organization? And are those experiences framed as a valid source of ideas for enhancing the organization's work and culture? And if you're able to incorporate all of those into your vision for the organization, you will see the business results that you're seeking and also sustainable D&I practices at your organization. And with that, we can move on to the questions and answer section.
Well, before we jump in, I want to thank everyone for all of your time with us. Lauren, Valerie, Meredith, Corey, really amazing and insightful work. Really grateful to be on a team putting together such wonderful resources. And recurring question is, yes, we will provide the slides and a recording of the webinar. We will send out a follow-up either tomorrow or early next week, so look for that. And if you have any specific questions that we probably won't be able to dedicate time to in our Q&A since we're near the end of the hour, I will reach directly out to you if you posted them in the Q&A channel. And also feel free to email me or any member of the team if it pertains directly to them, and they can try and answer your questions as they best are able. So I'm going to briefly touch upon some of our upcoming events and resources. We just recently launched, with the help of Lauren, a lot of intense and rigorous research from Lauren, putting together our D&I resource library that's available now on our website. That's the link below, but also again, feel free to reach out and we can provide that link for you. The topic and registration information for our December 17th webinar. I mentioned on the onset of this webinar that we were going to be discussing a client's culture transformation journey. We will get more into details and the topics that we're going to be discussing in detail for that. And we have some upcoming publications for our Transform Thought articles and research. And I know that this is getting into 2021, but we also have our next certification workshop slotted for February 9 and 10. So because we don't have a lot of time to dedicate to Q&A, like I said, I'll be reaching out to everyone who posted a question, but if you have any additional questions or comments that you wanted to share with me or any of the team members, we would love to get back to you. So just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are joining us from. And thank you all for spending some time with us, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.